To deliver the Blamey Oration, we welcome Professor Peter Leahy AC. Peter retired from the Australian Army in July 2008 after a 37-year career, which culminated in his appointment as Lieutenant General in the position of Chief of Army. Many in this room served under his leadership as Deputy Chief of Army and as Chief of Army, a position he held for 6 years. Peter is a graduate of both the Australian and the United States Army Staff Colleges, a Fellow of the Australian College of Defence and Strategic Studies, a graduate of the British Higher Command and Staff Course, and is inducted into the US Army Command and General Staff College Hall of Fame. He is currently a professor and the Foundation Director of the National Security Institute at the University of Canberra, teaching undergraduates on matters relating to national security. Peter is also Chairman of Soldier On and the Red Shield Advisory Committee in the Australian Capital Territory, and patron of the United Services Institute of the Australian Capital Territory. He was also Chairman of the Australian International Military Games, which brought the Invictus Games to Sydney in 2018. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Peter Leahy to the podium and invite him to deliver the 2025 Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey Oration.
Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in particular to the RUSI of New South Wales, thank you for the invitation. It's a real privilege, and thank you also for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here to speak to you about this topic: recruit and retain, challenge in sustaining a defence force in a modern democracy. While I acknowledge this is the framework for the dialogue, recruiting and retention, I want to place the topic in a broader context. Overall, Australia's security situation is poor and deteriorating. I consider the nation to be in peril. The warnings are there, the risk is high, and the consequences could be catastrophic. What's being done? Not enough. Our defence force would struggle to meet likely tasks, and we'd have great trouble in sustaining operations for even a limited amount of time. As a nation, we face many headwinds, and what I'd like to do this morning is talk to a few of them. In particular, how we're ignoring the risk, how we're not being strategic, what I consider to be a declining social licence for defence in Australia, and finally a question: who will fight for Australia? If you haven't been paying attention lately, you might have missed the many warnings that Australia is facing the most dangerous strategic circumstances since the Second World War. And most recently, we've got Mr. Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defence, speaking at the May Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, where he warned that the strategic threat from China is real and potentially imminent. He urged Australia to increase our defence spending and strengthen cooperation with the United States, and he left a clear impression that the US would fight for Taiwan. Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, agreed at the conference that China has engaged in a significant conventional military build-up and that Australia needs a stronger military. In Singapore, Minister Marles said he was up for a conversation about spending more on defence, with a 3.5% of GDP figure put forward by Hegseth. At the June 2025 Defending Australia's summit, Minister Marles again spoke of his concern of how China's actions were reshaping the regional strategic environment. However, since Singapore, he's reversed his views on defence expenditure. is now much more closely aligned with the Prime Minister's views and plans. These are to raise defence expenditure to 2.33% of GDP by 2033 and 34, and many defence commentators agree that this is not enough and it's not happening quickly enough. The Prime Minister has been at pains to affirm Australia's independent defence policy and that Australia would determine its own defence priorities, and he is opposed to arbitrary spending targets. Greg Sheridan in The Australian wrote that Anthony Albanese has mulishly rejected the call of 3.5% of GDP. And the Prime Minister, meanwhile, continues to seek strategic balance, security with the United States and prosperity with China. This was always a difficult balancing act and is now getting harder by the day. If we're going to establish and sustain a defence force, we need to have a view of what we want it to do. And this requires an understanding of the threat and the likely risk. From this we determine likelihood and consequences, develop a strategy, preferably for national security, not just for the Defence Force, and then allocate the necessary budget. It's my view that we don't have a proper appreciation of the current risk, that we're in strategic deficit, and we're certainly not allocating an appropriate budget for a defence force to adequately mitigate the apparent risks. I think we're very much constrained by our strategic culture of relying on a great and powerful friend and of being a junior partner in a large coalition force. This approach may just catch us out as the United States wants a much greater contribution from its allies and friends. And we can see this clearly in Mr. Trump's attitude towards European defence, and just over the last few days we've seen that come to play. With Mr. Albanese yet to meet Mr. Trump, we're going to wait for this issue to settle. Well, on risk, I think it's apparent. National risks include sovereignty, independence, prosperity, and the destruction of our physical infrastructure. Personal risks include death on the battlefield and physical and psychological injuries. These destroy families, lives, and our hopes and aspirations. And I'm sure we've all been to the Australian War Memorial, where the wall there starkly illustrates how often and regularly death has been the consequences of the many wars that we've been involved in. Those who fight for Australia rely almost exclusively on politicians, senior military officers and civilian bureaucrats to set them the right missions and assess and alleviate the risks. We often blame the generals for tactical and operational failures, and of course many of them are culpable. But in general terms, they can only do as they are told and use what they're given. Our politicians are those who have the ultimate control over which wars we fight, the partners and allies we choose, the strategies we select, the way we fight, the resources allocated, and how ready and prepared the force is for what is to come. Now, over history, and I count myself as one of these, defence officers and officials have a poor record of alerting and transferring responsibility for risk to the politicians who can take the right steps to diminish it to acceptable levels. Of course, politicians are not always happy to hear of defence and security risks because their primary view of risk is clouded by their personal and structural attitudes towards defence, their inherent political nature, seeking compromise, and a desire to succeed at the ballot box. In these days, in Australia, individual and party re-election is closely aligned with social largesse, or what we call butter versus guns, or guns versus butter. And I think this is an abrogation of the primary responsibility of our elected leaders to provide for the adequate defence and security of the nation. With too little spent on guns, Australia's current ability to defend and secure the nation is reduced. The almost total lack of consideration of defence matters during the recent election campaign and a focus on a far-off, distant future force demonstrates that our politicians are ignoring the obvious risk to our national survival and sovereignty and troops on battlefields far and wide. In my view, today without the United States, we would be almost defenceless and certainly unable to achieve our defence strategy of shape, deter and respond. Self-reliance is a sham, and our independence and sovereign control is compromised. I think we've probably all heard politicians point out that the direct alignment of Parliament House across the lake and up Anzac Parade to the Australian War Memorial reminds them of their responsibilities to our troops on battlefields far and wide. It's hard to reconcile this expectation with the current state of Australia's defence. The force may be able to respond, but only to a limited range of tasks and for a limited time. I don't think we can conduct sustained operations. My second point is that I don't think we have a strategy which would guide the force. I've previously written, I haven't changed my mind, Australia is a strategy-free zone, and we don't have the acumen and culture to sustain the force. We might talk about national security strategies, military strategies, economic strategies, diplomatic strategies, climate strategies and information strategies. However, we've seldom developed one that works. I think we're in strategic deficit and it's hurting us. And I'll give you some evidence. The obscene gap between the Department of Foreign Affairs White Papers 2003 to 2017, and we're working on another gap. The almost surreal strategy to acquire new submarines. What's the next instalment? The absence of realistic and achievable energy and climate strategies. At a time when cyber war is raging and the war in space has begun, I don't think we've got a clear idea how to proceed. China has left us wallowing in their strategic wake. Look at their activities in the South China Sea, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, and what they're up to in China and increasingly now through the Pacific. Australia's forces withdrew from Afghanistan and Iraq after 18 and 16 years respectively. It's a hard question, but what did we achieve? Following the US on a mission of revenge was never an adequate strategy. I'm not sure that we can focus Indo-Pacific or Europe or the Middle East. We are a small nation with limited resources and we need to focus, and I think a strategic partnership with Europe is a step too far. We need to realise that we are not and never have been a creative middle power. And overall, we shouldn't believe our self-priming rhetoric. In the now vanished National Security Strategy of 2013, Prime Minister Julia Gillard attempted to define the links between what we want, the ends, what we are doing to achieve it, the ways, and what resources we have to dedicate to the task, the means. And this is the classic strategy from Clausewitz, calculation and coordination of ways and means to achieve ends. And I give credit to many other strategists, but the calculation and coordination of ways and means to achieve ends. I think Australia has failed to understand and to make this equation work, and provide functional strategies. We don't know what we want. We don't have the adaptability or imagination to determine the approach, and our resources are limited. Right now we seem to want everything, and there's no mechanism to determine what our priorities are. And as a result, we're not doing anything particularly well. We can't have everything, so the starting point should be a serious discussion on who we are as a nation, what we stand for, what are our values, our interests and our objectives. We need to consider if there are any things we don't want and won't accept. And in the context of an increasingly authoritarian, confident and technologically advanced China, the big strategic question is, what does Australia want? Security or prosperity? Do we have to choose, or can we have both? And on top of this, the big question is, what do we do if China attacks Taiwan and America responds with military force? The question remains, prosperity or security? I can't see a way that we won't be involved, especially as the current places for US bases and forces in Australia really do start to look like bases. That's a debate to be had. Are they places or bases? At the same time, authoritarian rulers and religious and secular fundamentalists have shattered the boundaries of domestic and international norms. They have weaponised the internet and social media sites. The effect is to undermine the political processes and cohesion of nations. So I do think it's time that we started to think strategically, and it has to be founded on the questions of what we want and what brings us together. While I have no real issue with identity politics, my concern is that there are too many identities and too many flags. They are undermining national cohesion. As a nation, we seem intent on finding things that will drive us apart rather than things that will bring us together. We need to be clear-eyed and consistent about who we are and what we want to be. We need to be proud of being Australians, and we need leadership. Only then can we begin to be strategic and begin to fill our strategic void. Right now I'm watching with some interest the plethora of strategic documents related to defence. Lots in the last few years, and it's hard to sort of put them all in the right space at the moment. And now we have an intent to update the strategic review every 2 years. And I'm not sure that 2 years is a strategic time span. My third issue is, who will fight for Australia? As I hope I've made clear, Australia's defence is already at risk due to an inability to think strategically and identify and deal constructively with risk. Now, the failure to meet recruiting and retention targets for the Australian Defence Force may further jeopardise our ability to sustain the force. What if we have a war? We don't have a strategy, the equipment isn't there, and apparently there aren't enough motivated and trained people in uniform. We know that there are shortages across all elements of the force and at most levels of rank, seniority and skill. And Tash, I'm not picking on you, but not so for generals and their counterparts who seem to be flourishing throughout the force. To resolve the recruiting and retention problem, the government has approved an ambitious workforce plan to increase the defence workforce, and I've had the privilege of listening to General Fox outline that plan, and I thought it was really good. I wish you luck implementing it, and we'll hear more about it from General Fox later in the day. But we're also watching across the globe where defence personnel shortages are not limited to Australia, but are part of an international trend. Canada is short of its authorised strength, with a real problem in retention. Recruiting figures in the UK are improving, but the Army is still falling short, achieving about 1/3 of its target. Of interest are reports, though, that over half of UK applicants gave up on their process last year, often due to long delays. Of greater interest is that of the US Army, and they've recently seen a major recruiting turnaround. It's met its 2025 goals 4 months ahead of schedule, with their highest recruitment levels in 15 years. Now, some speculation, and these figures are all early figures, and they may not be entirely accurate, it's the best I can do at the moment, but speculation puts the changes down to a renewed focus in the US on warfighting and lethality, and an improved recruiting process. I think we're going to see the improved recruiting process. We're going to see an improvement in the mechanics, but will this help us achieve the new targets? And I rather suspect that there's something else at play here. Surveys such as the Scanlon 2023 Social Cohesion Report identified a declining sense of pride and belonging in Australia. There are also strong indicators that young Australians feel less connected to national identity and military traditions. Let's be old-fashioned and call this loyalty to Australia, a commitment to serving the nation and a sense of patriotism. And that's what military service is about: purpose, values and loyalty. It's about service and sacrifice and contributing to something bigger than yourself. And clearly that's not for everyone. So perhaps the biggest issue about who will fight for Australia is a decline in national pride and a dilution of our Australian identity and culture. Witness the active debate about the legitimacy of Australia Day, including the involvement or lack of involvement of a former Minister for Defence and a current High Commissioner. Also witness, I think, that there is a sense of entitlement and self-indulgence abroad, suggesting that the nation owes individuals something rather than the other way around. So whether it harks back to a place of origin or some narrow self-interest motivated sentiment, too many people and groups want special treatment and consideration. It doesn't leave much room for Australia. And too often now identity is defined by victimhood and has become associated with the wrong that's been done to you. I attribute this next statement to my wife. There are so many victims out there that we're in danger of running out of offenders. Military service is about fighting and the application of lethal force on the battlefield. ADF recruiting commercials are, I think, muted on this point of service. Recruiting advertisements too often resemble lifestyle commercials, but I think they're changing, Tash, and I hope you're part of that. And they emphasise what the ADF can do for you. Not much mention of what you can do for your country. And to me, part of the problem is that the dominant theme of the advertisements focus on the ADF. Recruits join armies, navies and air forces. Why hide early career service from the point of recruitment? Why not focus the advertising on single service units and subunits where team, pride, fighting spirit and traditions reside and the hard work is done? I think the ADF story can come later. And if you're in any doubts here, watch a US Marine Corps advertisement. I joined today. They are just terrific. That's what we're talking about. My third point is about social licence. Another headwind to sustaining the force is the damage to the reputation of the ADF. I've spoken already about social cohesion. Now let's consider for a moment social licence. The Australian Defence Force has an enviable reputation which has been built up over more than 125 years of service and sacrifice. It's accepted and trusted by the Australian community because of its history and deep connections with the Australian public and ethical behaviour. It's been a winning force. We used to have victory parades. It's met the community's expectations and needs and has acted selflessly in the best interest of the nation. It's been transparent and accountable. It's represented the nation with distinction. This has meant that a career in the Australian Defence Force, or Army, Navy and Air Force, has been a point of pride for individuals and families. And recently, I think we have to admit, the reputation of the ADF has been damaged because of war crimes and unacceptable behaviour. Criticism of behaviour, while due, is often overdone and regrettably has generated a negative attitude towards joining the ADF. And clearly there can be no letting up on behaviour and standards in the ADF. Nor should we accept that prosecutions due from the Brereton report and the Office of the Special Investigator have taken so long. It leaves a festering sore that impacts on the reputation of armies, navies and air forces every day. It's taken too long to resolve. The lawyers are in charge and the commanders are next to help us. A social licence relies on the community believing the organisation will act in their best interest, and it's a key for long-term success. And once lost or damaged, it's very hard to recover. I haven't been avoiding what a modern democracy might be, but to be frank, I'm not sure how to deal with it. Like many of us in the military, I've been avowedly apolitical throughout my career. I know at our military colleges we're taught when you go to the mess, don't talk about sex, religion or politics. We often failed about the sex bit, but we didn't talk about religion or politics. My only political view is I have little regard for them. And with regard to sustaining a defence force in a modern democracy, I feel a bit like C.J.S. John Gray in the early 1990s, and you might recall that there were long-lasting discussions about what the flag Australia should have. He said, I don't choose it, I just protect it. And I rather think that's my attitude to working in a modern democracy. It's decided by the people of Australia, and this has to be respected. But we are seeing throughout the globe at the moment that democracies are facing multiple challenges and are not performing well. Many are succumbing to autocracy, chaos, criminality and corruption. We should be proud of our democracy, but wary of how it's splintering along multiple lines of interest. And I think this makes it less cohesive and prone to dispute. Let me conclude. Australia's future security will depend on our ability to have public support, the right strategy, the right equipment, and the right people at the right time. I don't think our record is so good. Many in the room were involved in East Timor. We weren't ready. And the type, nature and range of forces available for Afghanistan and Iraq curtailed our deployment options. Political decisions restrained the number of troops and capabilities deployed to the detriment of tactical and operational objectives. And I think this is a problem for battles yet to come. Can we expect anything better in the future? Certainly not if we can't even acknowledge the risk. So as well as improving the mechanics of recruiting, the more important task is to restore a sense of pride and belonging in Australia and a desire to serve the nation. At this task, the military can only do so much. And I think the primary responsibility belongs to the government and the public. Both the government and the public need to get to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thought-provoking. Thank you for your candour. Thank you for your comments. Can I now call on Ted Blamey, the grandson of Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey, to just say a few words and to present the Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey Medallion on behalf of the Memorial Fund.
Your Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beasley, President Kim Turner, and distinguished members of the Royal United Services Institute, and Professor Peter Leahy and visiting experts. It's an honour really to be asked to pay a brief tribute today to the service of Field Marshal Sir Thomas Albert Blamey and to present the Blamey Medallion to our distinguished orator. I'd like to put to you that Blamey served his nation loyally with distinction through 2 world wars, bore enormous responsibility, workload and stress with equanimity, was loved and hated in equal measure, was Australia's most decorated commander, yet shunned by our post-war Labor government, pursued personal publicity intent on the task, the immense challenges which he willingly accepted, made enemies at home while confounding those enemies with whom we were at war. It was well known that he had an iron constitution, an exceptional mind, especially for matters military, was a shrewd judge of character for a rare commander and leader, blunt, decisive and brilliant. He cared deeply for and strove to protect his soldiers. He was fond of whisky, and both when young and after his first wife died in 1935, fond of women. He was not careful to conceal these imperfections. He could be tactless. He frequently put the press offside and others. Prime Minister Menzies had stated none matched him in power of command, a quality hard to define, but impossible to mistake when you meet it. Late as Arthur Cornwall said, the next man to blame is like a curate to a bishop. Like others bearing the bones of command, he made mistakes. In the Kokoda campaign in particular, it's these and the disaffections of Sidney Rowell and Chester Wilmot that the pop historians repeatedly crop out, his character impugned. And sadly, in Australia's tall poppy world, their selective views increasingly became the prevailing public narrative, lacking balance. Yet from Gallipoli to the Somme, from Gaza to Greece, from Tobruk to Tokyo Bay, at the Victoria Police Force and in civil matters, history shows Blamey's impact to be huge and lasting. So though it's challenging to summarise his career in a few minutes, I have felt the following towards a balanced, fairer, more accurate view of Tom Blamey's legacy. The 7th child of a drover from Wagga, Tom became the first Australian to pass the entrance examinations unaided to the Imperial Staff College, Quetta, India, joining it in 1912, winning the admiration of fellow students who became senior colleagues in the British Army. He landed at Gallipoli on Anzac Day, 1915, not yet 31, as a major. A staff officer, Tom also proved his mettle in the trenches, helped negotiate a temporary truce for a mass burial, had an ingenious periscope rifle adopted, and he learned the consequences of Australian formations being deployed at the whim of the British commanders. Blamey then joined the Somme offensive. Having briefly served as the field commander by June 1918, he'd risen to be Australia's youngest ever general officer, selected by Corps Commander Lieutenant General John Monash as his Brigadier General Staff. Tom was 34. Together, they devised a wholly innovative battle strategy, deploying troops, tanks, artillery and aircraft in concert. The famous Allied victories at Hamel and Amiens ensured a swift result and were remarkable for their low casualty rates, turning the tide decisively in the Allies' favour, and it's widely accepted foreshortening the war by 12 months. Between the wars, Tom chaired the committee that established the RAAF. He served 11 years as Victoria's Chief Commissioner of Police. Then, at 52, jobless and with difficulty in paying his way, the greatest of all his meagre assets was the reputation he'd won in the War of 1914-18. Still, in the late 1930s, he was a lone voice persistently warning about the threat posed to Australia by Imperial Japan and urging preparedness for the inevitability of a Pacific War. Australia declared war on Germany in September 1939, and TAB, then 55, was recalled to the Army, charged with forming the 2nd AIF and promoted Lieutenant General. I quote, "A proud Australian to his innermost being, he took steps to ensure that his charter from the government was watertight to reserve the right of veto on the use of our forces. He used it throughout this war to protect the ordinary soldier from rough usage by foreign commanders. He selected carefully his senior staff, telling his generals, 'I've chosen you because I think you will look after the troops.' He formed and shaped the army, simultaneously holding 3 essential roles. Commander, Allied Land Forces, responsible for the land defence of Australia and offensive operations. Commander-in-Chief of the Army, responsible for the training, development and administration of an army that was to exceed 12 divisions, over 500,000 personnel, and the government's chief military advisor, working within a tricky Allied command structure while protecting Australia's interests against the demands of its more powerful allies. He loyally served both the Liberal and Labor wartime governments as the only Allied commander to be at its top from the beginning to the end of the war. As AIFC in the Middle East, Blamey was key to the victories in the early stages of the war. In 1941, he with Raoul effected the near miraculous Allied withdrawal from the disastrous Greek campaign, initiated largely for political reasons by the British. Blamey later said, "The outstanding lesson here is that no reason whatever should outweigh military considerations when it's proposed to embark on a campaign." Against strenuous British opposition, he drove for relief of the Australian garrison at Tobruk. Then, in December 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, landed in northern Malaya, attacked Thailand, the Philippines, Wake and Guam, Hong Kong, and were coming south. In March 1942, Prime Minister Curtin appointed Blamey Commander-in-Chief of the Australian military forces as a full general. Another quote, "A command far larger and far more complex than Monash's in the First War awaited him. For more than 3 years it was to demand all the energies of mind and body. He was to be more or less constantly under political and sectional attack." In the Papua campaign, under intense pressure of MacArthur's drive for quick results, he made some early mistakes, but oversaw a masterly campaign on the beaches, the first defeat of the Japanese on land anywhere at Milne Bay, and their eventual defeat. He was behind formation of the Medical Research Unit that radically reduced malarial infection rates among the Allies in the Pacific. And in 1944, Blamey pressed the idea of forming an Australian National University with wide and lasting social importance to our nation, and the associated Howard Florey Medical Research Institute. So his contemporaries were glowing in their tributes to Blamey. Monash: "He served me with exemplary loyalty for which I owe him a debt of gratitude that cannot be repaid. He had an extraordinary facility of self-effacement." Wavell: "Probably the best soldier we had in the Middle East. Not an easy man to deal with, but his military knowledge was unexampled and he was positive, firm and a very satisfactory commander." MacArthur: "His services in the Second World War were not sufficiently recognised. What he did cannot be overestimated, and his contribution to the defeat of Japan marked him as one of the great soldiers of our time. Australia, and indeed the whole free world, owe him a debt of gratitude." And Professor David Horner: "Blamey was Australia's greatest and most important soldier." Tom Blamey commanded a victorious army, ensuring our nation's independence with at times little support and against many internal and external pressures. From contemporary accounts, it seems clear that no other would have been able to do what he did. In September 1950, Governor-General McKell presented the Field Marshal's baton at Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital. Tom had not the strength to deliver the acceptance speech he planned, but it began this way: "I want the survivors and families of those who fell to know that I have frequently been moved beyond words by what I've had to ask of them and by the manner in which they invariably responded. His speech concluded, I can no longer lead them, but I commend those familiar army words in which is so often combined all that was best of exhortation and encouragement. Carry on. I was there. I was 5. Thomas Albert was my grandfather. In May 1951, 20,000 people filed through Melbourne's Shrine of Remembrance for Blamey lay in state. 10 generals and 4,000 troops escorted the gun carriage which bore him. 300,000 people lie in Melbourne streets in sorrowful silence. Sir John Monash has been commemorated justly in many ways by a grateful nation. Yet there's very little to commemorate Blamey, one of the most influential Australians of all time. More troubling is that his name is essentially unknown outside the armed forces. But the Blamey Memorial Fund perpetuates his memory through the annual Blamey Oration, and we've been most privileged today to have that delivered in a most powerful and insightful way by former Lieutenant General Peter Leahy, Chief of Army at the time and now Professor. So if you would come forward, I would like to present to you the Blamey Medallion to thank you for your address today.